Hi all. So today we're going to talk about obesity, and we've talked about obesity a fair amount in this class so far. But today we're going to talk more specifically kind of about behavioral, government policy, environmental determinants of obesity. So on that note, let's jump in. So in order to discuss obesity, we're going to need some way to define it. And this is how the Center for Disease Control and Prevention does so. And they use the BMI. And so while I know there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding BMI, it's just what we're going to use for this purpose. And so furthermore, it's not important that you memorize these BMI ranges. It's just here for a frame of reference. So we have some way to kind of discuss when we talk about normal weight or overweight or obese. We have to have some kind of way of thinking about this. And so obesity is a serious public health problem because it's associated with so many of the leading causes of death in the United States and worldwide, including things like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some types of cancer. So this is kind of how we're going to do and look at what BMI is in terms of being obese and overweight. So here's a map of obesity rates by adults in the United States. For each state back in 1986, just kind of an arbitrary point in time that I started. But note that there are many states don't even report data, and I'm not sure why they don't report data. Maybe it wasn't something that was necessarily tabulated by each state at that time. Maybe the obesity rates were so low in these places that have no data that it just wasn't being able to statistically report it. I don't know. But the key thing here is to really see that there's really two categories, less than 10% and the highest range, 10 to 14%. So let's kind of see how this has evolved over time. I think we all kind of can guess on that. So here's a map of obesity rates for adults in the United States for 2018. So a few things to note about this. One, all states are reporting obesity, and we have Colorado and Washington, D.C. that are reporting the lowest rates. And recall from the 1986 obesity map, the highest obesity rate was between 10 and 14%. And this isn't even a category in 2018. And now there are 9 states with an obesity rate greater than 35%. So first, we can look here. We have Mississippi and West Virginia tied for first place at 39.5%. You know, it's kind of probably pretty interesting the differences of what leads to the obesity rate. West Virginia was very heavy into mining and so forth, and those kind of things have dried up. And so whether it's kind of poverty that drives that and so forth, depression, who knows? There's lots of different variables as we'll see. And then we can kind of go down to Arkansas at 37.1%. So it's clear that obesity is increasing across the board here. So the question then is, let's take a look and see if these similar rates are seen for different races. And so here we're looking at obesity rates for non-Hispanic white adults, and the CDC at this time just kind of lumps it for 2 years period, 2016 and 2018. And here we can see a different picture than the previous map. However, West Virginia still tops the spot at number 1 for obesity. And kind of looking at this map, one question might pop into mind is why obesity rates for non-Hispanic whites is so much higher in West Virginia, as I said, than say Washington, D.C. or Colorado. Not sure. You know, Washington, D.C., probably a lot of higher educated people, probably have good paying jobs. Colorado, maybe it's a more active state. People more involved who move there, who live there, want to be outside, moving their bodies more. West Virginia, maybe not. So there's lots and lots of different factors, and there's not just one thing that we can point to. So here we can look at the obesity rates for Hispanic adults in 2016-18, And here we can see that Hispanics tend to be more obese than non-Hispanic whites, and they seem to be across more states as well. Again, why are we seeing these differences? What's different in terms of Hispanics and whites? And here we're looking at obesity rates for non-Hispanic Black adults for 2016-18. And it's quite clear that non-Hispanic Blacks have a significantly higher obesity rates than all other races that we've been looked at. And so why? Why is that? Could it be due to education, poverty, maybe exercise? They don't enjoy exercising as much. Maybe they don't like to sweat. Maybe being overweight is more acceptable in their culture. I don't know, but there's something going on. And here's a nice graph that we can kind of look at and just kind of give it just a quick overview. We'll kind of look at obesity rates by sex and race, and we can just look at men and women. One thing that we can definitely notice is that non-Hispanic Asians have the lowest rate of obesity for both men and women, and by a significant amount. And why is that? And this is the United States. So why is it for 2017-18? Why is that? Why do you think that might be? All we can do is kind of look at some of the research. We can make educated guesses. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's exercise. Um, maybe it's just the way they live their life. Maybe they're more active. Maybe the food they eat. But we do see, for example, if we were to look at China, and as China becomes a more developed country, more foregoes their native culture, adopts the Western culture, which is sedentary lifestyle and eating standard American diet. We definitely do see obesity rates growing, and in China, it's kind of one of those biggest reasons for their obesity rates are just climbing. So, but in the United States, maybe less so for some reason. I think probably first generation Asians probably um, have lower BMIs, but as they kind of become second, third, it probably increases. But still, it's just significantly lower. So in order to kind of help explain these things, or at least kind of pose some interesting questions, uh, we can kind of look at what's the rise, what's the variables of obesity rates, and kind of what's going on. And we can look at it in terms of behavioral, environmental, and then some kind of government policies in terms of obesity, and kind of looking at ways to tackle this monumental problem. So the first we'll look at is behavioral determinants, and we can look at overconsumption of high energy foods, physical inactivity, sedentary behaviors such as screen times, even book reading, just sitting, we sit. And so overconsumption refers to a state in which food intake exceeds the individual requirements, supplying an excess of nutrients and energy. And overconsumption of high energy foods and lack of physical activity are kind of the main behavioral risk factors for people to develop obesity. So those are kind of the core things. We're eating a bunch of high energy, palatable, easily available junk, and we're sitting a tremendous amount, whether we're sitting to commute, whether we're sitting at work all day, and then we come home and we're tired and we sit and we watch Netflix. We're just sitting. We're no longer do we have, generally speaking, physically active jobs. We're no longer out in the fields. We're no longer standing on assembly lines, moving all day. We're not doing kind of nomadic living and so forth. And so these behaviors are influencing a range of individual level factors, which are kind of nested within the context that contain influential characteristics kind of further upstream. And so these specific eating behaviors that are associated with obesity include frequent fast food consumption, eating occasions away from home, which have increased a lot, large portion sizes. The portion sizes from, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago have grown. How many times do you go to a restaurant and maybe they give you a small portion for whatever and you go, Jesus, that's a skimpy little bit of food. You know, we get upset about that now. We expect to have huge plates and huge portions. If not, we feel like we're getting ripped off or something. And then we also have this high consumption of beverages that are high in sugar, and also the omission of eating breakfast. You know, that's a big one, you know, kind of skip breakfast and fast. Should you eat breakfast? You know, there's so much conflicting information on that. Just open up social media and you don't know what you should do. Should I eat? Should I not eat? So in the process of kind of this domestication, we went from this hunting and gathering food to planting and planning food production. And we've kind of advanced our methods to secure food resources, and we've been created these environments that make access to food very easy. 24 hours a day we can have food, right? We can either drive somewhere, deliver it, or open up our refrigerator. Simultaneously, this smart engineering kind of alleviated heavy manual work, and that populations, as I said, just sit more. Despite busier schedules, we sit a lot more. So in other words, we've kind of adopted the context to which we live in. So here's just some interesting graphs I got from Our World in Data. You know, they're interesting to look at, but there's, you know, correlation is not causation. They don't explain the whole picture, but they're interesting to look at kind of these trends. And we can look at back in 1961, and we can look at the total calories, 2,880 kilocalories. 2013, which was the latest available data, is 3,682. So we've definitely increased the amount of calories we eat, but also we can kind of look at where is that calories really coming from. And I didn't create the percentages, just kind of we'll just kind of ballpark these things, but it looks like fat is the significant increase. And so whether that's, and then there's also animal protein went up a little bit, but not much. So I guess we're not getting the fat per se from animal proteins. We must be getting fats from these vegetable oils and things that are packaged in these processed foods. So we're basically getting uh, the worst possible fats, and we're eating more of those. And also the total number of carbohydrates have increased too. So again, correlation is not causation, but there are just some interesting trends to see. Here we can kind of look at dietary composition by different commodities. And so if we look at 1961, same amount of calories, and look at the total calories in 2000, and I'm basing on this, 2013, we have 3,682 kilocalories. But we can kind of look and see where are these calories changing the most. Sugar, a little bit. Again, oils and fats is pretty high. That's changed from 532 up to 890. So again, those kind of oils and fats are probably not monosaturated fats like olive oil, avocado oil. Those are probably cheap, low cost vegetable oils like soybean oil, which is probably one of the worst, canola oil, vegetable oils. Those are all high in omega-6s, which can cause inflammation. Meat consumption hasn't gone up much. Fruits and vegetables has barely budged. But the big thing is these cereals and grains went from 628 to 800. So that's kind of seems like one of the larger jumps. Again, that's probably eating all these breakfast cereals and other kinds of bakery kinds of goods. Anything that's kind of palatable, cheap, long shelf life, and convenient to eat. So that's kind of what we are. So now let's kind of look at some environmental determinants of obesity. And environmental determinants of obesity can be kind of broken down into kind of two areas. One is kind of our built environment, and the other is social. And we'll talk about the built here. So the built or the physical environment consists of its man-made construction components. For example, roads and sidewalks, buildings and houses, parks, plazas, and more. So currently our physical environment is built to accommodate and prioritize transportation, and specifically cars. You kind of look at, for example, Europe. Europe was largely built before cars, and so everything is the streets are smaller, mixed use buildings, uh, convenience to walk to things or ride your bike. Where in the United States, we were largely built during the car era. So we see that. So the built environment encompasses a range of physical and social elements that make up the structure of a community and may influence obesity. So there are several factors that seem to correlate consistently with weight status, and namely that's urban sprawl and land use mix. So evidence from the US has shown that residents living in sprawling suburban with low residential density are generally more likely to be obese, right? So that's kind of, you're less inclined to walk somewhere. You have to drive to your job. Maybe you have to drive to your friends' houses or relatives' houses and so forth. So um, you have just less chance to move your body, and there's also less chance of kind of social interaction, social engagement. Another relative consistent finding is the link between land use mix and obesity, such that better mix of residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, recreation, and agricultural land use is generally associated with less obesity, right? So I know the city of Boise is trying to do more mixed use where you have on the bottom, you have businesses or grocery stores, and then up top, you have residential places. And that allows you to come down, shop, walk around, socialize, which are all very important in terms of obesity and longevity and lifestyle kinds of ways, as opposed to live far away, get in your car, drive to the mall, go to the store, get back in the car, drive to your car. So a lot of sitting, a little walking around the mall, but not much. So further environmental influences consist of the proximity to large supermarkets, the concentration of fast food establishments, and restaurants in any kind of given area. For example, large supermarkets provide a wide variety of healthy foods at a reasonable price, which may influence food purchasing behavior and thus be available for more healthy foods to have at home. This in comparison to neighborhoods that don't have access to supermarkets and the residents rely essentially on corner stores or fast food restaurants, which typically offer poor quality foods that are high in fat and sugar and lack fresh fruits and vegetables and lean proteins. You know, these fast food places, corner stores, these are the places that we just looked at that have these poor oils. So you're eating a lot of vegetable oils. They also have lots of these carbohydrates that we're talking about. So areas that have these limited access to affordable and nutritious foods are referred to as food deserts. And a food desert is just like I said, within a certain circumference of where you live, you don't have access to a grocery store. All you have access to is either no food or these corner stores. So, however, there's this new research that suggests that food deserts might not be the only culprit, or maybe not even the culprit, but something called a food swamp. And those are in addition to being low in grocery stores, food swamps are also crammed with unhealthy food options like corner stores and fast foods. So if you live in a neighborhood that has no access to a grocery store, Fred Meyer, Albertsons, something like that, but all your only choices are McDonald's, Arby's, Jackson's, something like that, you are living in a food swamp. And that might be even more difficult for somebody who, for example, does not own a car and can't drive, or taking a bus is inconvenient or can't afford that. And so you're just stuck. If I'm going to eat, well, gotta eat crap. So finally, childhood obesity is strongly associated with adult obesity. So the school environment is of interest in kind of ensuring a healthy eating environment in schools. However, kind of many socioeconomic and political forces contribute to the problem, from anything from budget cuts that slash school physical education and sports programs, to the proliferation of vending machines on school campuses, candy and snack food manufacturers, soft drink bottlers, and fast food restaurants heavily market in schools. I mean, how many times do you go to your school gymnasium and see the Idaho Beef Council or the Idaho Dairy Council or Pizza Hut? They aren't in there just because of goodwill. They're not in there for your best interest. They're in there marketing to your kids. You know, especially like Pizza Hut. Kids come home, had Pizza Hut. Mom, Dad, can you go buy me Pizza Hut? There's planting the seed at a very early age. They're marketing to you. They're trying to build loyal customers from a very early age on. So it's a big thing. And so many of these schools now rely on these revenue sources from having these advertisements in there, having the vending machines in there, selling donuts and candy bars for fundraisers. These are all ingrained in our schools, and we just kind of take it for granted. So that is kind of one thing about our built environment. And then the social environment is the way that we relate to others. It has also been studied extensively in relationship to obesity. And the most consistent social determinant of obesity is socioeconomic status and inequality. So in higher income countries, kind of lower socioeconomic status and more inequality in general is associated with higher levels of obesity in adults. And the influence of other people, such as your neighbors, your family members, friends, colleagues, and other social network members, is also an important correlate of obesity risk, right? You're more likely to adopt or be like the people you hang out with. So if you're hanging out with a bunch of athletes and fit people, you're definitely more likely to adopt those lifestyles and be like them, as opposed to somebody who maybe likes to watch TV or play video games. You're going to adopt their kind of lifestyle. So the people you hang out with has a huge, significant influence on your behaviors, whether you're aware of it or not. So it's also been shown that obesity spreads through social networks over time, mainly via siblings and friends. So explanation of this perceived effect of social networks includes social contagion, which I just kind of talked about, whereby the network influences obesity-related behaviors via modeling, and social capital, whereby a sense of belonging and social support influence obesity-related behaviors, and social selection, whereby an individual's network is a function of their weight. So we don't maybe think about that too much, but kind of think about the people you hang out with. Are they similar to you? Are they different than you? There's definitely going to be always a person or two who's different than you, but kind of take a look at that. So social and the built environment are critical. So the final thing here, or not necessarily the final thing, but it's the kind of the role of government in obesity. And so here, I kind of just read these two things here. For the most of human history, including the 20th century, insufficient food was the great nutritional challenge. To tackle this, government sought to stimulate the production and distribution of as much inexpensive food as possible, in particular starchy, high carbohydrate, staple commodities that were kind of stable on shelf. And in time, the global pandemic of obesity and chronic disease from a widespread range of inexpensive, unhealthy food was inconceivable. So that's one part of it. Kind of the government kind of subsidizes, perhaps the government subsidizes the wrong things. They subsidize monocultures, they subsidize beef. Maybe they're not subsidizing healthy foods, not subsidizing kale, they're not subsidizing vegetables and fruits. So maybe that's a problem, but that's a huge problem, huge task, I should say, to overcome. And the healthcare costs range from 147 billion to 210 billion annually, every year, or 21% of the total national healthcare spending per capita. Medical costs of an individual with obesity is $2,741 higher than those of normal weight. So every year. So significant problems. So the question is what's the role, if it should be at all, of government in obesity intervention? Um, and that's kind of a hot debate too. Do you want the government to infringe on your liberties, to tell you what to do, or not? And there's people that are on both sides of that. And so policies are often confused with programs. For example, a public health program is a system or a plan that an agency implements to provide a service. For instance, a public health department might run a bicycle safety program for children, offering classes and other educational resources, where a public health policy, on the other hand, generally refers to a government law, some regulation, rule, or a contract establishing some kind of standard or requirement. For an example, would be a bicycle master plan, which provides guidance on how local streets are designed and where new infrastructure or facilities are needed to promote active transportation, recreation, and safety. For example, the city of Boise, not long ago, was trying to update their master plans, in terms of taking some streets, removing side parking to make access to a bike lane to encourage people to ride bikes. But as you can imagine, people get extremely angry. The store owners, less prices to park, people aren't going to shop. People who don't ride bikes or value that, and they just want to drive their car, well, now it makes the streets more crowded. We should widen the streets. So none of these things are easy, and none of these things are going to be easily solved. So for example, New York Mayor Bloomberg tried to pass a public health policy that banned all large sugary drinks that are larger than 16 ounces. So ultimately that policy didn't pass, but do you think it would have any impact on obesity? I mean, sugary drinks definitely result in somehow obesity, but that still doesn't solve people buying a bunch of smaller drinks. There's also indication that drinks that are with artificial sweetener might lead to obesity as well. But I still can have my Big Mac. I can still sit all day. I can still come home and have large fries and a bag of chips and watch Netflix until 2 in the morning and get minimal sleep, which is going to result in weight gain too. Sleep deprivation or being tired leads to poorer choices in food as well. So you might be more likely to binge eat if you're tired or opt for bad food. So one little thing isn't going to solve anything. So another example, in 2016, Chile faced this huge health crisis related to obesity. The rate of obesity had doubled since 1980 and was set to push the national health care costs by 750 million every year for the next 2 decades. So the government took this radical action, banning the marketing of unhealthy foods to children, prohibiting their sales in and around schools, and stamping these kind of large black signs on packaging of food with high levels of sugar, salt, fat, or calories. And so if you just Google Chile and these kind of marks, they're kind of like this hexagon, I think, if I remember my geometry very well. So, and they're on each packaging. And so these measures seems to be paying off according to researchers, but it's kind of, they report kids are avoiding these foods with these stop signs, and mothers are changing their shopping habits and putting healthy food on the table. Time will tell, whether it has an effect. Another policy, in 2011, Denmark became the first country to introduce a fat tax. I don't remember if you recall that, but I do. And they had this tax on butter, milk, cheese, pizza, meat, oil, and processed foods if that item contained more than 2.3% saturated fat. However, in November of 2012, the Danish tax ministry announced it would abolish the fat tax, stating that it failed to change Danes' eating habits and encourage cross-border trading. So if you kind of look at some of these reports, The Danes were buying lots and lots of things now from Germany, for example, to avoid this tax. And so it put the Danish jobs at risk and has been a kind of this bureaucratic nightmare for producers and these outlets. And so the failure of this Denmark tax was also due to financial reasons. Um, Politicians were saying they identified this tax as a funding source for the government. And also, it's kind of like what influence did uh, the food industry have on changing these things? So it's difficult to pinpoint these things, and you can't really say government has your best interest. I mean, we all know that smoking causes cancer. It's horrible for your health, but we don't ban. So why don't we just outright ban tobacco? You know, we know it's not good for you. I don't think anybody who has kids are hoping, I hope my kids smoke. We don't ban it, do we? No. It's probably because it's the farmers for the tobacco industry, the taxes it creates. Um, those are all more important than our health. So, so kind of putting it all together. And so I kind of, at this point, I hope you realize and you can appreciate the complexity in trying to reduce the the obesity epidemic. And it's not a simple one prong approach, as we can see. There's kind of this multitude of factors that play a role in obesity. And there's no simple policy or simple behavior change that we can enact that's going to curb this growing trend. You know, outside of any medical advances that could reverse or prevent obesity, kind of a medicine or a genetic modification, any hope for kind of a solution lies in the fusion of these health policies, healthy environments, healthy behavior, with each of these presenting its own kind of myriad of challenges. You know, maybe it all just really does start with us and making changes. I don't know. I don't really know what the solution is. I don't think anybody else knows really what the solution is. It's going to take a bunch of things. So one thing I would like you to do is if you're not familiar with blue zones, it's kind of that term was coined by somebody named Dan Buettner who worked for the National Geographic. But I would encourage you to do some research about these blue zones and kind of while the focus of blue zones is specific to longevity, there's many kinds of things that correlate. Longevity definitely correlates with obesity, obesity longevity, kind of the way we interact, our social environments, um, how we communicate with other people, how we kind of go about our physical activity. You know, we're not going running marathons, we're not going lifting a ton of weight. We're moving throughout the day. We're always kind of moving. Doesn't have to be heavy moving. It's just kind of walks, gardening, maybe some light exercise, biking, running things, but we're doing these kind of things throughout the whole day. And then the types of foods eating. You know, we're not eating McDonald's, we're making foods at home and so forth. So I would encourage you to kind of do a little Googling for blue zones and take a look at that and see those. So on that note, have a great day.